Good evening again, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out on a rainy night. My name is Bill Lindsay, Richmond City Manager. We'll go ahead and get started. And on this is our first community workshop on the rent control ordinance, rent control and just cause for eviction that went into effect December 30th of 2016. It was voted approved by the voters in November of 2016. So we're just in the beginning of the implementation stage right now, and I'll talk a little bit about that. First, I wanted to acknowledge some staff members who have been working very hard on getting this going. We put together a team of city staff members who are in essence temporarily staffing the program until it's turned over to a rent board. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that. Shasa Curl has been the lead of that team. Some of these people you may have met outside. There's Shasa Curl in the back, and if these individuals can wave or something, you may want to ask questions of them later on. Paige Rusa has been doing a significant amount of work. Paige is over here to my left. Gabino Arredondo is standing there next to the monitor, also doing a great deal of work. Three other people who have been working very hard on this: Mariah Fairley, who is out registering people as they come in; David Padilla, also at the registration table; and Sofia Perez Leon, who I don't believe is here this evening, but has also been working on implementation. And then I also wanted to thank Mike Uberti, who is in the city manager's office and has been doing a lot of the work with our website, getting that going. And hopefully I haven't left anybody out in terms of the rent program, getting that going. I did want to acknowledge and thank Fire Chief Adrian Shepard for being here over to my left. And you can clap for him, that's okay. And you may have some questions about the fire inspection programs and other aspects, and he can help with that. I wanted also just a quick kind of housekeeping item. This PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website, so you can access it there. You'll see that website name. It's www.richmondrent.org. And we'll post that again, but www.richmondrent.org. That website provides a lot of information also about the program, has the requisite forms that we'll talk about. And again, we will post this PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully will answer some of the questions that you may have. What we wanted to talk about is just provide an overview of the Richmond Fair Rent Just Cause for Eviction and Homeowner Protection Ordinance, as it's called. Talk about the timeline, how it is being implemented, how we've started to implement it. One of the things you'll find in the ordinance, or as I speak this evening, you'll hear things that sound like jargon. They're actually defined terms in the ordinance. And so it's important that we talk about what those definitions are. So we'll talk about key terms. And since we opened the office back in January 3rd, all of 2 weeks ago, we have started to receive, and even before that, we started to receive a lot of questions from tenants and landlords, and we've started to compile those as frequently asked questions. You'll see those on our website as well. On the content here, the name of the ordinance, again, the Richmond Fair Rent Just Cause for Eviction and Homeowner Protection Ordinance. It was adopted by the voters in November of 2016, became effective December 30th. It establishes a 5-member Richmond Rent Board, and that really is they are the program managers, the way this ordinance is set up. Managers, administrators, oversight function very independently. It provides tenant eviction protections, and it limits rent increases on applicable rental units. Then it also requires that landlords complete and file notices of termination of tenancies, rent increases, and changes in terms of tenancies with the rent board. So the rent board compiles all this information as the program is going along. One thing you'll see later on is we are trying to, as much as we can, to make this a paperless system. So we're trying to do a lot of things online, filings online, so that the rent board has access. We want to make sure that it's in searchable databases, and also easy for both tenants and landlords to access information. Another thing that the ordinance does, it establishes a petition process where landlords and tenants can petition for an individual rent increase or decrease. And that the idea there is to ensure that landlords are able to receive a reasonable return on their investment, and that tenants are afforded a process to request a rent decrease as well. So right from the ordinance, it talks, this is the point I mentioned before, is there's a section called Integrity and Autonomy of the Board. And in essence says that the city provides sort of the infrastructural support, office space, phones, and so forth, as it would with any other department. And during the transition period, this is before the board members are appointed and before an executive director is hired, the city is empowered and required to take steps necessary to perform the duties of the board and implement the ordinance. So we are right now in that interim period. There hasn't been a rent board that has been appointed yet, and there has not been an executive director hired. The executive director will be hired by the rent board, not by the city, but by the rent board. And so what happens right now is we're trying to put this infrastructure in place, and after the rent board is established, after the executive director is hired, we can in essence turn the keys over to them, and they will run the program. The way it's set up, again, City Council appoints the rent board. They also have the obligation to establish the residential housing fee. However, the rent board, which is appointed by the City Council, establishes all the regulations and procedures that are necessary to implement the ordinance, and they establish their own budget. And they let the City Council know, this is our budget, please adopt this amount of a fee to be charged, and the City Council, if it wants the program to break even, will establish that level of fee. The rent board then hires an executive director. They are the long-term rental program administrator. I'm on the lower left there, city manager. I'm hired by the City Council, and I am the interim rent program administrator. And a lot of times we'll talk about, among the staff, we'll talk about interim administrative decisions. You know, there are some things where we're deciding what needs to be done in order to implement the ordinance, and we're trying to follow exactly what the ordinance tells us to do. Wherever it's not absolutely clear, or you can go either way on the implementation, we are doing an interim administrative decision, and those are subject to change by the rent board and by the executive director later on. Timeline again, reading left to right. July 21st, 2015, that seems like a long time ago, but it's a significant date because that is the date for determining the base rent that is defined in the ordinance. So July 21st, 2015 is that base rent date. Again, it was adopted by the voters November 8th, 2016. The City Council approved the 2016 rental adjustment and temporary and permanent relocation payment amounts. That's another thing that's an obligation of the City Council. That was December 20th. The ordinance became effective 10 days after certification of the election. Election was certified December 20th. The ordinance became effective December 30th. And our office opened on June 3rd. It's on the second floor of this building right upstairs, and we're glad to have you drop by. Let me talk about some of the key terms that are important to really to understand, to really get a handle on how the ordinance works. So we'll talk about the rent board, what just cause for eviction means, what rent control means, provision of state law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. You may have heard that. We'll talk about how this applies, what the base rent is, consumer price index, what the maximum allowable rent is, and the annual general adjustment. Those are all terms that are defined in the ordinance. So first, rent board, not appointed yet, but it is appointed by the city council. The way that process works with the city council is the mayor proposes candidates and the city council approves candidates that are proposed by the city council. That has not happened yet. They are required to be Richmond residents. It's a 5-member board again. And the way it is specified in the ordinance is no more than 2 members of the rent board may be those who own or manage rental property or are realtors. So it's intended to be not skewed one way or the other in terms of who's appointed or who's represented. The rent board has the ability to approve rent adjustments, charge and collect fees, and mediate disputes between landlords and tenants. I would note that since the rent board has not been appointed yet, if you're interested in finding out more or becoming a rent board member perhaps, you can contact the mayor's office and throw your name in for consideration. Another term that's in the ordinance, right in the title, is just cause for eviction. And what just cause for eviction means is that residential tenants can only be evicted for one of the following just causes. And when the tenant does, or I'm sorry, when the landlord does exercise their right to evict a tenant, they have to provide the reason for that eviction. So again, just cause. Those causes are if a tenant fails to pay rent, breaches the lease terms, is creating a nuisance, doesn't give access to the landlord, and then the other 3, if the landlord temporarily vacates the tenant in order to undertake substantial repairs, maybe they have to completely redo the place and the tenant needs to move out for a while, that's considered a just cause. If the owner moves in, that's a just cause. Or if the unit is being withdrawn from the rental market. Now the bottom 3 have an asterisk, and that's because in these particular cases, even though evictions are allowed, even though those are just causes for evictions, there may be there is a relocation payment that may be required. So it's intended to make the tenant whole for having to move out of the unit. That's the idea. And it's like a no-fault eviction. It wasn't the cause of the tenant, and so the tenant, in essence, is allowed relocation payments. Then rent control. Rent control, in essence, means that there's a ceiling or maximum allowable rent for controlled rental units. And a controlled rental unit is many units in the city. It's actually easier to say what's exempted from the rent control. Hotel or motel rooms are exempt. Hospital, medical care, convent, dormitory rooms. Rental units owned, operated, or managed by the government that are specifically exempt from municipal rent control. And this is very significant, and because this applies to a lot of units in the city, and that is single-family homes, condominiums, and new construction are exempt from rent control. And that's in accordance with the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which I'll talk about in just a second. Also, small second units that are built in compliance with the small second unit ordinance of the city. So what are commonly referred to as granny flats, those are exempt also. I mentioned the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. It's California state law, and the ordinance is intended to comply with California state law. And what that law does, it exempts certain types of units and new construction from rent control, including, as I said, single-family homes and condominiums. And also I mentioned new units, and that is defined as units which were issued a certificate of occupancy by our building department after February 1st, 1995. So if there was a unit that was built and occupied in 2005, that's exempt. If it was built and occupied before February 1st of 1995, then it is not exempt and is potentially covered, providing it's not a single-family home or a condominium. Also, Costa-Hawkins, this says establishes vacancy decontrol. It's actually, another way of saying is it prohibits vacancy control, and that means that Costa-Hawkins prohibits an agency from controlling the rent when the rent is when a tenant vacates it, because that allows the rent to reset to market, in essence, and Costa-Hawkins specifically provides for that. The base rent, that's a term, again, we have a July 21st, 2015 base rent. So if a tenant was paying $1,000 a month on July 21st, 2015, the base rent is July 21st of 2015, is what you were paying, is that $1,000. Let me start over. If a tenant was paying $1,000 as of July 21st, 2015, $1,000 is their base rent. Or let's say you moved in, a tenant moved in January 1st of 2016 and was paying $1,000. Then the $1,000 is the base rent, because that's the date of the last turnover of the property. I didn't say that very well, but it's actually simple. If they're in July 21st, 2015, that's the base rent. Then Consumer Price Index, I think this is a term everybody's heard. It's a widely published index. It's a measure of inflation, and what's important about it is that landlords is that this is the index which is used to adjust the rate on an annual basis. And let me talk about how that works. Okay, the maximum allowable rent is the most money that can be charged for a controlled rental unit. And the rent cannot exceed that maximum allowable rent, but it could be less. Landlords are not required to set the maximum annual. They can be less, and the maximum allowable rent remains the same, even if they charge less. And the maximum allowable rent is the base rent, July 21st, 2015, plus the annual general adjustment, which is CPI, and also in future years it would include individual rent adjustments. So individual adjustments that are decided by petition, that are petitioned to the rent board. But really, for simplicity, as we're implementing it, since those don't necessarily exist yet, it's really the base rent plus the annual general adjustment. So I gave an example here: base rent $1,000. The 2016 annual general adjustment of 3%, that was the change in the CPI for the time period that establishes the index. It's 3%, and so the maximum allowable rent is $1,030. So when we talk about the annual general adjustment, again, it's related to the CPI, and it's the annual general adjustment is calculated based on the change in the CPI that is reported in February. It's announced by the rent board in June, and then it's effective September 1. So let me walk through that. So in 2017, the rent board will look at what the change in the CPI was from February of 2016 through February of 2017. And it'll say, okay, the CPI change was, let's say it was 5%. Then they announce in June the annual general adjustment is going to be 5%. And then in September, the landlord, with proper notice to the tenant, would be able to implement that annual general adjustment, that 5% adjustment. So it's not really phased in, but the index is February to February, announced in June, can be effective in September. We're only on a different schedule this year because we're in that implementation stage, but that's how it'll work going forward. Okay, frequently asked questions. So, first of all, the question, is my home exempt from rent control? Again, Multi-unit homes, including duplexes built before 1995, are rent controlled. Single-family homes, certain small units, or second units, granny units I call them, and rental of a room within a home are not controlled. Does my home qualify for just cause for evictions protections? The answer almost uniformly is yes. All long-term renters qualify for just cause for eviction protections, but landlords can still terminate a lease. They can still evict a tenant, but it needs to be for cause. Those causes, again, failure to pay rent, breaching the lease, or repairs, and as we talked about, relocation payments may be required in some instances. Question we talked about before. What if I moved in after July 21st, 2015, and I lived in a rent-controlled unit? What rent should I pay? Well, your base rent is what you paid the first month that you paid rent. My example was you moved in January 1st of 2016, then that becomes the date of your base rent. So it doesn't go back to a previous tenant. It's your own tenancy for tenants that requires. Again, landlords need to give proper notice consistent with state law for rent increases. 30-day notice generally for rent increases below 10%. Yes. I'm glad my fact checkers are here. So what if my landlord is charging me more than the maximum allowable rent? Well, the thing to do is to contact the rent program, submit an official complaint, and maximum allowable rents are enforceable after December 30th of 2016. All of these official complaints will be collected by our interim staff and will be handled by the rent board and the executive director when they're seated. So that's the intent. Our intent is that we're in essence gathering this, but these decisions on these official complaints will be made by the ultimate rent board and executive director. Another question, my base rent is lower than what I was paying when the ordinance became effective. Am I entitled to a refund for the excess rent I paid between July 21st, 2015 and December 2016? So does everybody understand that question? Okay. So the answer is no. Your landlord's not required to refund rent that was lawfully collected before the paid in excess of the base rent before that ordinance became effective. And the effective date is December 30th, 2016. So it's only going forward after December 30th. It doesn't go backwards. It's not retroactive. It doesn't provide for rebates. What if I paid more than the base rent for January? Am I entitled to a refund? The answer is yes. The landlord is required to provide notice. On December 30th, on that date, all of the rents became the base rent. They reset to the base rent. And then at that point, your landlord must provide notice of if they're going to raise the rent. And again, it can only be the maximum annual increase. And let's use the example we used before. If the base rent was $1,000, or if you were paying $1,100 as a tenant, and your base rent was $1,000, then it resets to $1,000 as of December 30th, and then the landlord must provide 30 days notice of an increase of that maximum annual increase of 3% if they want to implement that. Okay, some questions we received from landlords. And actually, we received questions, the prior questions from landlords too, that everybody is interested in how it works. And we appreciate the fact that we're getting inquiries because it shows good faith compliance with this voter-approved ordinance. So what do I currently need to do to ensure I'm in compliance with the Richmond Fair Rent, Just Cause for Eviction, and Homeowner Protection Ordinance? Broad question, what do I do? What do I have to do? Well, the easiest thing to do is visit the website. That's the most important thing to do. Landlords and owners of residential rental units located in the city must annually submit a rent program enrollment application for each rental unit. In addition, landlords must file all notices of rent increases, termination of tenancy, and changes in terms of tenancy with the rent program. So really kind of two things. One is that initial registration, and the second is ongoing filing of information with the rent board. If you go to the website, you'll see the Forms tab, and forms that provide this that can be submitted are there and should be used. One thing I will tell you is that we're learning about, and we learn from people who have an experience with our website and the form. We've heard some outstanding input. This form's confusing. Can you change this? And please let us know. That really helps us. And I think as whether you're a landlord or a tenant, if this is the simplicity and the efficiency and the lack of paperwork or clarity of paperwork or clarity of forms, that's going to make your life easier. It's going to make everybody's life easier. So really, if you do have input, don't hesitate to let us know. We'd rather know there's a problem than have you reflect on the fact that there is a problem. Rent program website should be clear. Again, there's a section for tenants, landlords, forms and notices. This is the forms and notices section for tenants, landlords, various forms and fees. There's a procedure that's outlined in the website. I won't go over it in all kinds of detail for if landlords want to raise the rent. We've had that, again, frequently asked questions. How do I raise the rent? How do I implement a maximum annual increase? And you can create an account on a website. You can go into the form. There's a requirement, again, to notice the tenant, and there's a requirement that the landlords provide proof of service to the rent board. So, so again, that's important. It can be done with a form. It can be done electronically. And a proof of service is basically just a form that says, you know, I certify that I provided this information to the tenant. The enrollment form hopefully is simple to use, collecting the information for registering the unit. It's an interim enrollment form. Everything, again, we do is interim because it's subject to change, but hopefully we'll get it right. There is obligations for fees for landlords. A couple of these things that I'll talk about already exist, but for the rental program, this is intended to be a self-supporting program. That means that there's a fee charged to landlords to have this for this program. That fee is set annually by the City Council. It has not been set yet, but should be done soon, and that'll be a requirement with the annual registration. So all rental properties within the city must enroll in the Richmond Rent Program, just to summarize here. And it's anticipated that interim rent program fee will be established in late February, in about a month. And that, again, that'll be adopted by the City Council. The permanent relocation fees have already been established by the City Council. You can find these on the website. Remember what these relocation fees are. If they apply, in essence, if a unit is taken off of the rental market, and for those other reasons that are basically no-fault evictions, where the tenant is reoccupying the unit, where the owner is reoccupying the unit, there is the obligation to compensate the tenant for that, and those fees are on our website as well. Then I mentioned their temporary relocation fees. Let's say that you have a situation where you're going to be doing work on the unit for about a month, but during that, you're a landlord, you're going to be doing the work for about a month, the tenant needs to move out for 30 days, then there's a temporary relocation fee. Again, it's a no-fault eviction, it's a temporary eviction, and the idea is to compensate the tenant for having to move out for that short-term period of time. These fees are not new. The property owners that are landlords are required to get a business license fee. They're also required to participate in our residential rental inspection program. That's put in about 10 years ago to try to make sure that we have adequate housing stock. And then some units are required to have fire prevention service inspections as well. So, and what we're going to be trying to do is consolidate these and get some efficiencies so that so that property owners, landlords are not receiving a bill every month for this or that, but really consolidate them so you have planning on your cash flow. Business license fees, again, that's a requirement right now. So hopefully you're paying your business license fee. Single-family homes. I'll take questions later, but I'll just answer that now since I heard it. The answer is yes. It's exempt from rent control, but it's not exempt from getting a business license fee, or participating in the rental inspection program. Okay, how does this ordinance affect my ability to terminate a tenancy? Again, landlords retain the ability to terminate a tenancy for the reasons that I talked about before. But it needs to be for one of those just causes. And again, there is in some cases, relocation fees that are required, or relocation payments to the tenant that are required. If you, so the question was, I raised the rent on my property since July 21st, 2015. What happens now? Well, rents for controlled rent properties must be reset to the price paid on July 21st. Again, there's a rollback of that base rent to the July 21st date, but no refunds are required if there was a higher rent paid after that date until, again, rents reset on December 30th of 2016. Residential rental inspection program. This exists right now. Hopefully you are familiar with it. This is something that, again, it's been in effect for about 10 years. Fire prevention services. These are actually requirements of state law that units be inspected for fire safety, and that is a cost that's incurred by the city and passed on to the property owners.